More than 6 months later, the world continues to watch and follow this ongoing war in Ukraine. Again, as we mentioned before, on one hand, the entire international community is asking a question: what is the ultimate goal or the angle for Vladimir Putin to stop his ruthless behavior? But also, on the other hand, how about the economic and political shift to the international community because of the war? According to political scientists, that in the midst of the war, some countries are not only gaining more benefits on either side, but also it's playing a significant role in this economic and political, even social benefits at the same time. For example, how about the country of Turkey? Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite Eugene Chausovsky. And Eugene is a senior analyst at the New Line Institute, and his work focuses on political, economic, and security issues pertaining to Russia, Eurasia, and the Middle East. Eugene, welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thanks for having me.
No problem, sir. The pleasure is all mine. Now, again, when I initially discovered you, because this amazing article that you wrote, and is entitled, "Turkey is the biggest swing player in the Russia-Ukraine war." It's kind of ironic that, again, as we mentioned before, more than 6 months, the world still watches the ongoing war in Ukraine. But on the other hand, some countries such as Turkey, again, this is something that you wrote in the article as the opening paragraph. You said, actually, the Turkey is involved in the conflict on a number of fronts, from security cooperation with Ukraine and to energy cooperation with Russia, to serving as a diplomatic mediator between Kyiv and Moscow. So that presents a substantial opportunity and also a significant challenge for Turkey at this moment. Can you help us to understand, how should we understand this role of Turkey, as you mentioned before in the article, a substantial opportunity and a significant challenges ahead? Help us understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, Will, Turkey plays a very unique role in this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, in that it's really the only country in NATO that's able to have a positive or a constructive relationship with both Russia and Ukraine. And those relationships that Turkey has built up over the years has put it in a very unique position to be a mediator in the conflict. So we've seen that mediation happen successfully in the latest grain deal that Turkey, along with the UN, was able to broker between Russia and Ukraine. And we're seeing, those grain shipments actually start to move forward here over the last week or so. But Turkey is also trying to leverage that kind of mediation into a broader ceasefire. Now, when I talk about the opportunities and the challenges, the opportunities are, I think, quite clear for Turkey and for the global economy in terms of seeing how these grain shipments are now starting to resume. There was a lot of food-related issues, rising prices, even shortages in very vulnerable countries in the Middle East and Africa. So that's a clear opportunity that has presented itself to Turkey, and that it has essentially helped facilitate for the rest of the world. There's also diplomatic prestige for being able to broker such a deal. But when I talk about challenges, I think for the most part, Turkey has really struggled because it tried to mediate between Russia and Ukraine early on in the conflict, actually even before the conflict started. To prevent the war from happening. And that showed really the limitations that Turkey has. Even though it has good relations with both Russia and Ukraine, it's still not in a position to dictate or even really influentially shape the broader contours of the conflict, especially in the security domain. That's something that Turkey is trying to do, and I think something that the West and Russia are both interested in, but it's not there yet, and it remains to be seen whether it can do so successfully in the bigger picture.
I think, Eugene, during the previous answer that you brought up so many significant points, but again, I want to go back to what you said before. If Turkey is trying really hard to be the mediator between Russia and Ukraine at this moment, and again, not only, let's be more realistic, many countries since the outbreak of the war, that many countries try to be the mediators between Ukraine and Russia, tried, but however, they failed. Now, Turkey, as you mentioned before, is trying to balance the relationship. But let me ask another question is, how would you think that Turkey is actually building its credibility on both sides? So in other words, if Russia and Ukraine, neither side is willing to barge, neither side is willing to compromise, why do you think that Turkey can be successful, or perhaps Turkey cannot be successful in being the mediator? So in other words, what are the major practical but feasible strategies that the Turkish government is trying to come up in order to satisfy the needs on both sides?
So I think Turkey has, it's because it has real leverage with both Ukraine and Russia. On the Ukrainian side, Turkey does provide significant weaponry, including drones to Ukraine, which have actually been quite important in this conflict. And Turkey has used that in other conflicts in the past. I'm thinking about with Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh. But at the same time, Turkey has not signed up for the West's sanctions against Russia. So that gives Turkey some bonus points, if you will, against Russia, even as Turkey is supplying Ukraine with weapons. So I think both countries, both Ukraine and Russia, realize that Turkey is its own independent player here. I think, with other countries that have tried to mediate, including Western countries, that essentially is a because of the sanctions and other forms of support that they're providing for Ukraine. And then you have other states, that have tried to mediate, but they don't have that kind of relationship that Turkey does with Ukraine and Russia. So in terms of the practical, results, as I mentioned before, Turkey has proven with the grain deal that it was able to identify an issue that both Ukraine and Russia actually benefit from. Ukraine obviously getting to, export its grain that had been stockpiled and had been essentially blockaded by Russia. So there was an interest to unleash those exports. And even for Russia, it was able to essentially ease certain parts of the sanctions that would allow its own agricultural exports to be increased, because both countries actually rely on supply routes through Turkey or through Turkish maritime waters. So that it identified an issue that actually it was a win-win situation. That's why there is opportunities for it to leverage that into other areas. Even Ukraine has talked about potentially other exports being used through this zone, through Turkey, whether that's metals or other resources. But on the security front, that's going to be the bigger challenge. Is if Turkey is able to mediate successfully, it has to identify specific issues that both Russia and Ukraine can benefit from, because right now they're operating in a zero-sum game. Those negotiations are happening essentially on the battlefield. So it will probably be a little bit of more time before those options are exhausted, and then Turkey can play that role. But the more that it can actually, continue the grain deal, perhaps leverage that into other forms of economic cooperation, that does give it, potentially some momentum to leverage that into the broader picture.
Eugene, I want to bring another country into the conversation, even though you briefly touched on just a few moments ago. Let's bring U.S. into the conversation. Again, sitting U.S. President Joe Biden, since the beginning of the war, has firmly condemned the behavior of Vladimir Putin. And also, again, U.S. government has been the leading front on placing sanctions on Russia over and over again. But meanwhile, if we look at this historical relationship between U.S. and Turkey, and again, you're the expert, and we know the relationship, especially from this political and also this diplomatic aspect, the relationship between U.S. and Turkey has always been hot and cold. Now, I want you to help us to understand, how would you describe the relationship between U.S. and Turkey at this moment, and given the condition that no one would like to see the continuation of the war in Ukraine, and especially the U.S., again, as you mentioned before, because the food crisis and also energy crisis the whole world is facing today. But meanwhile, since Turkey can be a swing player, how would you think that we should understand this relationship between U.S. and Turkey at this moment?
So I think that the U.S.-Turkey relationship in ways can be described in the same way at the Russia-Turkey relationship, which is one of complexity. So they're neither complete allies nor are they complete adversaries. And in the case of U.S. and Turkey, there's a lot of cooperation, particularly with Turkey being a NATO member. So they're in that sense, they are security allies, and Turkey has played a very important role within NATO. There's also a lot of economic cooperation between U.S. and Turkey, but they also have some pretty significant challenges and significant differences. So actually, the U.S., just like it has used sanctions as a pressure tactic, against Russia in the war against Ukraine, but even in other areas, the U.S. also has sanctions against Turkey, which certainly serve to sour the relationship to a certain extent. Some of those are related actually to Turkey's weapons imports from Russia, which are obviously seen as a very negative thing from the side of the U.S. Turkey also has a pretty substantial energy relationship with Russia, and as I mentioned, Turkey did not sign up to the Western sanctions. So in that sense, that just goes to show Turkey's independent role, which is not always seen as favorable from the U.S. standpoint. And then there's also issues over the state of the political system and the status of democracy, human rights, things of that nature, that the U.S. will always have certain challenges with any country that it deems as not living up to those kinds of standards. So in that sense, as I said, it's a complex relationship. It's not overwhelmingly good or bad. It's just something that they deal with on a case-by-case basis. But because of Turkey's role now in the current context, not only in the Russia conflict in Ukraine, but also, as you mentioned, all of the global economic repercussions, I think that relationship is important to smooth out, at least on an issue-by-issue basis, to the extent that is possible for the United States.
Eugene, how much do you think the Turkish government can trust the U.S. government at this moment? Again, the reason why I'm asking this question is when we look at the foreign policy under sitting U.S. President Joe Biden at this moment, despite the fact that he traveled this year extensively to many parts of the world, again, he visited part in Asia, and also he recently wrapped up his trip in the Middle East. But meanwhile, experts continue to pay attention to discuss the effectiveness of foreign policy under Joe Biden today. So again, bring the conversation back is how much do you think the Turkish government can actually trust the capability and the skills of U.S., especially related to foreign policy effectiveness? Because we know that if U.S., let me put it this way, if U.S. can continue to be a front row or continue to be the leader in pushing the end of the war or in punishing Vladimir Putin or even this Russian government, but so far we have not seen any effective results. So going back to the question is, how much can we trust the foreign policy side from the U.S. government or perhaps even from the Turkish government side?
Well, I think, at least, from the vantage point of Turkey, and being here in Istanbul, there's certainly a degree of skepticism over the trustworthiness. And I wouldn't put that just on the Biden administration. I think it's, what the U.S. has dealt with, a major challenge of any democracy, right, is, turnover of government, and then that can lead to significant foreign policy changes from administration to administration. So looking at whether it's the Biden administration or going back to the Trump administration and then Obama administration before that, there's, all countries like Turkey have to plan for, these 4-year essentially election cycles, and they're not sure how sustainable, U.S. foreign policy will be over a particular issue. And here I think that the challenge for the U.S. is to have a more strategic perspective on things like this in dealing with Russia, policies that can be, certainly policies can change here and there, but, a more strategic look that it is not just susceptible to complete reversals from one administration to another. And here, again, I think that Turkey does point as an example of something that can be learned in the sense that, you can have these kinds of relationships even with adversarial countries. Here I'm thinking obviously Russia, but even a country like China, right, where you will certainly have tensions in some areas, but that shouldn't, necessarily poison your relationship within other areas, especially the more practical issues of economic cooperation and things of that nature. So, as I said, these are issues to be discussed, and hopefully they can improve on a case by case basis. But I think just because of the nature of the political systems themselves and how they differ, there's going to be some bumpy roads along the way.
Eugene, how dire is the situation regarding food crisis in Turkey at this moment? Again, as we mentioned before, because of the war in Ukraine, not only the country of US, but also across the continent, again, I travel extensively, for example, China, many countries in Europe and countries in Southeast Asia. Because of the war, and every single country is tightened the belt regarding the food, energy, and also the storage. But I want to go back to Turkey. How dire is the situation in terms of food crisis in Turkey? So in other words, I guess on one hand, people are arguing the reason why Turkey is being a significant player because the government is only thinking about how to continue to have enough supply for the citizens or also, for the government for the long run. But on the other hand, people are saying this is kind of a selfish act. So in other words, you place the priority, you place the interest of your country first so that you're willing to help out in the war, or you're willing to be the mediator between this Ukraine and Russia. But you are located in Istanbul right now, so help us understand how concerned is the government regarding the food crisis in Turkey at this moment?
So I agree that certainly some of the moves that Turkey has made is in its own self-interest. But it also can have, it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, right? If something is in your own self-interest, it doesn't have to necessarily come at the expense of other countries or other parties. And I think that the food agreement that Turkey mediated is a good example of that, because yes, while Turkey did not face the level of a food crisis as perhaps some of the more challenged countries in Africa and other Middle Eastern states, they did certainly have an interest, especially when it came to rising prices. It wasn't so much of a food shortage issue for Turkey, but inflation is a big problem here. We've had triple-digit inflation in Turkey over the course of the past year, and something very obvious here in Istanbul, and I'm sure other parts of the country as well. So in that sense, Turkey's economy has been weakened, just like the global economy has, as a result of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, or even exacerbated issues that predated that conflict. So in that sense, Turkey was both trying to alleviate its own economic challenges when it comes to food, energy, and other issues, but also to play a constructive role in helping other countries that were arguably even more in an acute situation when it comes to that. So we've seen, the food supplies now transiting Turkey and going to places in the Middle East, going to places in Africa. So I think that has been, a success in that regard, but it remains to be seen how long that can continue, and whether, as we talked about before, whether it can be leveraged into other areas to offset some of these global economic pressures.
Eugene, at the beginning when we see the war, everyone is trying to understand, or at least want to get decent understanding regarding the motivation behind a Russian government. But more than 6 months later, we're still watching the war, even though, again, the mainstream media has not actually reported on this one. But I think it's more concerning for a lot more people to ask the question. At this moment, Eugene, again, you're the expert. When we are watching the war in Ukraine, do you think it's more important to understand the solution, how to end the war, or it's more critical to focus on Vladimir Putin as the person at this moment? So in other words, do you think it's essential as an international community to come together to find a mutual or effective solution to end this war, or you think at this moment that we need to figure out what kind of characteristics that Vladimir Putin is, or how his characters or how his personalities is shaping the war in the long run? Which one do you think is more important?
Well, it's a good question. I would answer again that I don't necessarily see those two things as mutually exclusive. Certainly, there's Russia is a very top-down government, with Putin playing a major role. But also, I feel like there are certain factors behind Russia's conflict in Ukraine, not only starting this year, but going back to 2014, that would come in some form or another, perhaps not as as escalatory as we've seen now under Putin, but would be issues under any Russian administration, arguably, and that is essentially not only vying for influence over Ukraine, but really just trying to challenge the Western, the entire Western security architecture in all of Europe. So this is the issue, and this is actually what we saw a lot of diplomacy leading up to the conflict, which obviously was not successful in preventing it. But it was not only over Ukraine's NATO membership, but it was also over how and to what extent that NATO had expanded over the years, over the last decade or so in particular. So these are issues that I think need to be negotiated, obviously with the current Russian government, but also with a post-Putin future in mind as well. Because these are not something that, even in the best case scenario from the Western viewpoint, if for whatever reason Vladimir Putin was no longer in power, I'm not sure that it would solve all of the problems that the West has with Russia, and that Russia would automatically turn into some liberal democracy that wants to be aligned with the West. So in that sense, I think it's trying to find areas of common ground. This is a very difficult thing to do, especially in the current climate, but the more that there can be constructive engagement, pairing punitive measures like sanctions and other forms of pressure, which I think are necessary, but also pairing that with some constructive forms of engagement, whether that's economic, whether that's security, I think that could lead to a more stable relationship in the future.
Eugene, I know you're very busy, and I do really appreciate your time. I got two more questions before letting you go. Let's talk about Turkey in the NATO as a crucial member. Within this article, you also mentioned that Sweden and Finland for months, over the issue related to Kurdistan Workers' Party and also harboring other Kurdish elements that Turkish government deemed security threat in these countries. And we know that this year, because of the war in Ukraine, that Sweden and Finland filed their membership to be part of the NATO, and Turkey had a very strong negative saying in towards those two membership. Can you help us to understand, because it's for some of us it's really difficult to understand, why would Turkey try to block the membership for Sweden and Finland? So what role does Turkey actually play when we're looking at more members are actively participating, being the potential NATO member? Help us understand, Eugene.
Sure. Well, Turkey, as any NATO member, you need to vote in a unanimous way in order to expand the bloc amongst all members. And so, Sweden and Finland, it was a very, unlike, the challenges of absorbing a country like Ukraine into NATO, which has a number of different challenges associated primarily, that it's in active conflict with Russia. Countries like Sweden and Finland, these are countries that don't have obviously active wars happening. There's a lot of interoperability in terms of their military forces. They already cooperate quite a bit. So these are countries that are low-hanging fruit, if you will, in terms of absorbing them into NATO. From a purely technical and administrative standpoint, but politically, Turkey was able to hold that up, having that that right to veto essentially, and it did so again in Turkey's sort of independent way of doing things. It had no issues with these countries as NATO members. It was more so along the lines of their support for different Kurdish groups. Also related to that, some arms embargoes that they had placed. So this was prior to the NATO context. And this is, I think, another example of Turkey flexing its muscles in a way, showing that it can be, both a cooperative country, but also one that can assert what it deems as its own interests. And sometimes that happens to the benefit of the West, as we're seeing currently, I would argue. And sometimes that happens, at the expense of the West, if you will. But, they were able to diplomatically resolve those issues for the most part. But it does just serve as a reminder that, Turkey, perhaps more than any other NATO member country, is going to have that kind of independent streak and show its ability and willingness to sometimes, throw a wrench in the wheel, if you will.
Eugene, I want to wrap up our conversation again, going back to the article. Towards the end of the article that you wrote, and I quote something that you wrote: while the West is right to stand up to Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, it's also important to recognize that a multifaceted connectivity strategy that combines pressure with constructive engagement along the lines of Turkey's approach can be more effective. Now, help us to understand, what does that mean when you say multi-phased connectivity strategy? And again, when we look at the war, when we look at the conflict, not only just in Ukraine, but also across the continent in different parts of the world, countries are also suffering under this political, social, or even economic conflicts. So from your perspective, what is the meaning of the phrase, and how should the US and the EU partner in order to maintain, or at least to build the ground for peace?
Sure. So I think, the connectivity concept, and it's something that we've actually discussed now quite a bit in our conversation. And what I mean by that is connectivity can take on many different forms. It can have different themes in terms of, it can be energy connectivity, for example. It can be agricultural connectivity, what we discussed, with the Turkish mediated deal. Even I can think of, a security form of connectivity, whether that's the NATO, membership, or the NATO alliance, or even a military action. You can think of those things. So connectivity is not inherently a good thing or a bad thing. It's just the state of connectedness between these different players. And so when I'm talking about a multifaceted connectivity approach, it's basically along the lines of what I've argued, that, pressure, which you can think of as sanctions as a sort of a weaponized form of connectivity, right? Or how Russia has used energy cutoffs, also a weaponized form of connectivity. Whereas Turkey has tried to prioritize, not cutting things off, not weaponizing, but actually, building constructive measures. Now, I do think that there's limitations, to the extent that the West can do this. But I think the broader point here is that if you're relying solely on those forms of pressure or the weaponized or protective forms of connectivity, history has shown there's significant limitations in changing behavior in that way, especially for, a major power like Russia. Whereas if you can combine those forms of pressure with a more constructive forms, which we've seen, again, to a very limited extent, but important one in the agriculture sphere, right? If we can leverage that, perhaps that can build the case towards what Turkey, and I would argue the West, ultimately wants, which is a ceasefire. But that takes, a very complex strategy. It's not easy to maneuver, but I think it's all the more important given the state of the conflict that we're in right now.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm speaking to Eugene Chausovsky, and Eugene is a senior analyst at the New Lines Institute. And I strongly encourage everyone to go online and look for Eugene's amazing article. Again, it's entitled, Turkey is the biggest swing player in the Russia-Ukraine war. Eugene, thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show. And again, I know you're traveling in Istanbul. Please stay safe and let's stay connected. And we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue not only just to follow and pay attention to the war in Ukraine, but also regarding this political and also this economic changes around the world. Thank you, Eugene.